Thanks everyone for joining us. Welcome back to Tiny Webinars. We'll jump right in a second. Just a quick news alert. I'm going rapid fire on Tiny Webinars. More guests, more topics, more growth, more learning. If you know someone who can share something awesome with our Tiny community, I want to know about it. So hit me up at dearandrew@tinypulse.com or on Twitter at Andrew Sumitani. Some terrific guests lined up. Next week, I've got the VP of Product at Microsoft OneDrive and Office 365, Omar Shaheen. He's going to join us on Tuesday. Be sure to sign up for that one. You can get the early jump. Follow us on LinkedIn to get in on that Tiny webinar. He's going to share how he manages the team of people building the apps that you need to do work and school and all of the productivity needs of literally most of the world. So we'll also do a breakdown of the top questions organizations asked employees in Tiny Pulse in 2020, questions that are going to help you get to the bottom of what's holding your organization back. So don't forget to follow Tiny Pulse on LinkedIn and Twitter. We just published some new data on onboarding and the perils of remote onboarding, and just showed the delta between what's happening for remote hires, especially, and building bridges between the organization and new hires. So you'll be the first to know when we have new guests. I love these new headphones. Maybe we'll do some giveaways on the show. Stay with me. All right. Just some quick housekeeping. Today, I've got an awesome guest with me. Eric has prepared a really special talk. I'm going to do the driving for our hour-long session today. We'll reserve that last 15 minutes for Q&A. So don't forget to add questions in the Q&A in your Zoom. Vote those questions up and down so that we can ask the most relevant ones and the most popular ones that are most meaningful to you. The codes for SHRM and HRCRE professionals, I'll drop in the chat at the end of today's session. I do believe that one of our codes is still pending, but I'll send that to you via email after our session as well. Recordings will also be available. So if you can't make this entire thing, I'll send it to you via email afterwards. We will also have some interactive polls, so stay tuned on your screen. We want to know the data for those. Eric's asked some really cool questions. And finally, Tiny Pulse is a feedback and survey company, so don't forget to help us improve these Tiny webinars with our post-session survey. Today on Tiny Webinars, we're hanging out with a powerhouse. Yes, he was the longtime senior HR at Dell. He spent over 10 years at Dish Network as the SVP of HR and the CHRO, and most recently the CHRO of Radio, a leading e-commerce provider for none other than GameStop, who you just saw in your headlines coming into this webinar. He's not only an experienced practitioner, but he also coaches and teaches you how to be a better CHRO and a better leader. The man, definitely not a myth, but the legend, Eric. Well, Eric, I'm delighted to have you on the show. We were chatting before this, and I know you brought just loads and loads of knowledge with you today. Before we get started, just tell us the one thing you want leaders in HR to take away today.
Oh, good morning, Andrew. Can you hear me okay? Good morning. Hello. Well, Andrew, I guess first of all, I want to thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. In answer to your question, what I would say is I would encourage leaders on this call, whether they're chief HR officers or HR leaders at a variety of roles, or they're leaders of organizations, to think big. This pandemic we're talking about is a tragedy that has far-reaching implications on all of us professionally and personally. But as leaders, my hope is that we all take advantage of this opportunity and find positive ways to support our people and our organizations in new and different ways. So this is an opportunity to actually think big. And that's the idea behind this webinar, and that is how do you thrive, not just survive, during unprecedented times.
Terrific, terrific. So I know that you brought a deck. I'm going to do the driving today. So folks, thanks for bearing with us. Eric would normally drive, but he's actually doing this off of his phone. So a virtuoso Zoom soloist indeed. So what have you brought for us today?
Well, Andrew, as we talked, we thought there's a variety of things we could talk about, but I'm sure like all of you, we're all dealing with this pandemic in both personal and professional ways. And I thought this would be an interesting time to talk about ways to think about how do you position yourself and your organization to really thrive. So I've done a lot of research over the last few months as we've all been experiencing this, and I wanted to share some ideas, some thought-provoking ideas. I hope that'll get you thinking about ways you can step up your game as a leader, whether you're in HR or leading an organization within the business, and guide your leadership team to think differently, act bold in innovative ways to make a real difference for your employees, your customers, and your shareholders. So with that, Andrew, why don't we go on to the next slide, and let's talk about what's going on with the pandemic. Obviously, I know you all watch the news. I'm certain this has impacted you both personally and professionally. The World Health Organization declared this a pandemic many, many months ago, which was obviously, a massive decision on their part. The stats, I don't need to review a lot of them with you, but they're staggering, right? We have some tremendous impacts going across the world. So let's think about your own life. My guess is that all of you have been impacted, perhaps personally, as well as professionally. Here we are dealing with a massive number of cases. March 11th was when the World Health Organization declared we had a global pandemic. There's more than 100 million cases declared globally, 2.1 million deaths and growing globally, with new aggressive variants that are now in more than 20 states in the US, as we all know. In the US, more than 25 million cases so far, about 250,000 new cases a day, 75,000 cases per million people in the US, and approximately 3,500 to 4,000 deaths a day. So the numbers are staggering. What's really concerning for me, I think we all know, is that about 50% of cases are linked to asymptomatic carriers, which means this is something that we've never really dealt with before, which means we all need to be so vigilant. The challenge is that our healthcare system is being extremely stretched, where most of our ICUs are at or near 100% capacity. So now think about how it affects you. We're all working from home, and this is a big challenge. I, for one, have been impacted. I've been so fortunate that my family hasn't contracted COVID, but I've had a lot of friends that have, and lost one of my dearest friends in April of last year before we knew much about COVID. And it's very, very personal for me. So that's why this topic is so important. So on the next slide, Andrew, let's talk about what we think is worthwhile talking about today. First, we'll talk quickly about the mental and physical health impacts. As importantly, as leaders in your organization, we spend some time talking about the impact on your organizations and your industries. I'm sure you're well aware of those, but perhaps we can share a little broader perspective of what's happening on a more macro perspective. What's on the minds of CEOs? All of us work with senior leaders. Thought I'd share some insights into what's on the minds of leading CEOs in some of the world's most impressive companies, and then strategies to really thrive, not just survive this pandemic. And then we'll leave time at the end for Q&A. Next slide, Andrew. So let's talk about our health, right? Obviously, the pandemic has had far-reaching effects. Here's a list of some. It's not meant to be all-inclusive. I won't speak for you. Many people I interact with as employees, as leaders in my personal life, are dealing with personal fears about protecting themselves and their family. Right? We're far from through this. We're targeting 1.5 million vaccinations a day, and that still is not going to be enough to get us through this. Social isolation is tough. We've all been going through it. It's tiring, it's burdensome, it's exhausting. In my case, I won't speak for you, too much closeness with some, not enough with others. I really miss the joy of going into the office, working shoulder to shoulder with people, working with my clients, my customers, and employees. Some of you may be dealing with personal grief due to the death of friends or family members. I have. It's not to be underestimated. Affiliation is important. We're all human beings. And times of stress, we crave that, we need that. But COVID obviously changes the world we're in. And we're all doing our best to do the right thing, to watch out for ourselves, our friends and family or neighbors. And obviously it's a passionate issue. We saw that happening up and through the election, where social distancing and personal protective equipment were quite politicized, which is tragic. I won't take sides, of course, but it's just important we understand that it's a passionate issue for people. And obviously, we're still learning every day about what the long-term effects of COVID are. And once you're through it, it doesn't mean that the long-term effects are gone. So burnout is on the rise. A lot of people are reporting that they're depleted, they're exhausted, they're feeling negative, and that's okay, that's expected. A leading research company in employee engagement found that 63% of people that are suffering from burnout are more likely to take a sick day. So as leaders in the organization, think about that. They're 2.6 times more likely to start searching for a job and leaving your organization, 13% less confident in their performance, and half as likely to discuss goals and their performance with their manager. So among millennials, who make up the majority of our workforce these days, 28% report frequent burnout and 7 of 10 report some. So what are the implications? How do we all deal with this tragic experience? How do we foster cohesion in groups, in person and virtually? Here we are. And then how do we better support our people, which is the job of many of you on this webinar. So how do we anticipate and adjust the return, right? We're not quite there yet, but it's starting to happen, and now is the time to be proactively thinking through it. So let's move on to the next slide. So the organizational impacts, here are just some of the questions I would suggest you be thinking about. If you haven't already, your organization is deep in the throes of trying to think through, how do we quickly evolve our products and services to impact our employees and their roles and their core capabilities, right? This pandemic is really accelerating the changes that were already underway. And it's an amazing opportunity, even though we're dealing with some tough implications. Now is the time to be really reimagining how you approach everything in your organization. How do we engage with our current and future employees effectively, right? We used to take these things for granted. I always wondered what it would be like if we could work remotely a little more often. And I think the world has stepped up to show that most people can and will do it effectively, but it doesn't come automatically. Building the best teams, always the heart and soul of what great HR leaders do. It matters more than ever. So when was the last time you took a real close look at your playbook and evolved it in a big way? Data. Data is business these days. So the data science, which is part of what great HR organizations also do, and the type of predictive analytics you can bring to your team matter a lot around how you build the best team, how you design yourself to get work done more effectively for your customers, your shareholders, and your own employees. How do you build engagement levels? We'll talk about that. And then ultimately, how do you execute better? Because your competition is focused on the same thing. Around leadership, we all know it matters. It's what I focus on every day, but ask yourself, are you sure you built a critical core capability to select and develop great managers who become great leaders as a core competency? Not just something you do, but something you excel at. And then from an employer perspective, now more than ever, their demands are going up. They expect local climates and company cultures that uniquely and authentically fit them. So the question you have to ask yourself, is yours clear? Is it differentiated? Is it compelling? Is it enough to attract and retain your best people? And how do you know for sure? Have you asked them? We'll talk about ways to leverage engagement strategies to know. So one more question related to this, if you just advance, is the question is, are we moving fast enough? So this survey was done by McKinsey among CEOs and their client group. And what's interesting about this data, and I realize it's an eye chart, I'll let you absorb it here for a second, but on the left side are a number of important strategic initiatives that many organizations were trying to tackle before the pandemic began. And the question of these CEOs was, how long do you think it'll take to implement these types of changes? So take the first one. If I want to dramatically increase remote working capabilities and collaboration in my company, how long do I think that'll take? Most CEOs said it would probably take a year and a half. Well, the pandemic hit. Now think back to what happened to your organization in March. In my organization at Radial, we ended up moving 90% of our workforce remotely within 2 weeks. Think about that. If you had said to yourself, how long would it take to move, say, 3,000 customer service agents to a work at home arrangement with thin clients, remote telephony, hardware, training, support, transforming everything you do about how you recruit, train, and support agents day to day? Do you think you could do that in 10 and a half days? Well, the answer is a lot of companies did because they had to. So 43 times faster than they thought they could. The list goes on, you can see, around changing the way your customers interact with you. At Radial, for example, we ended up seeing a 40 to 50% uptick in e-commerce activity within 2 weeks once shelter-in-place orders started to be pervasive across the country. So in that case, we ended up having to double our workforce very quickly, 6 months ahead of our normal peak schedule. So I'm certain many of you have examples as well about things you've had to do that forced your organization to transform miraculously in really quick order. So this is, I think, a very positive thing in that organizations are much more capable of taking on big challenges and adjusting extremely quickly when they need to. So I thought this was interesting data. Hopefully it is for you as well. Let's move on to the next slide. This slide talks about trends that many of us are already familiar with. The headline here is that these were already underway. What's important is that COVID-19 has accelerated these trends even more. So when you talk about connectivity, for example, right, we are connecting ourselves with one another in both personal and professional settings in unprecedented ways, 24/7, 365, and it's become quite disruptive in terms of how companies and organizations evolve their services. Information moves much more freely. And the question that we should all be looking at is, what are the things that are disruptive or getting in the way of a free flow of information? It's not just all information, but the right information. Finding those challenges, breaking down those silos, those hurdles, those hierarchies, because we'll talk about org design in a few minutes, making sure that the people who need to be connected are connected the right way, at the right time, on the right things. On the top right, we've known this has been happening. The opportunities for organizations to jump into your space are as great as ever, and the transaction costs to do so are dropping all the time. So those barriers to entry are clearly changing. So we learned about this years ago. We talked about the initial onset of .com companies and these small little companies that came out of nowhere and started to take on massive organizations that were the gold standard, at least thought of at the time. The reality is that those barriers of entry are changing, and the proprietary products and services that you think you have may not be so as much. So paying attention to how your organization evolves is really important so that you stay a step ahead of your customers' needs and your competition. Let's talk about automation. We're seeing unprecedented levels of automation, and COVID has accelerated that as well. Let's look at artificial intelligence and robotics that are fundamentally changing so many industries. Not necessarily to replace the workforce, but to improve how well they do their work. I personally believe that artificial intelligence has a bright future and can improve how employees do their jobs in a fundamentally better, more efficient, more effective way that potentially is more enjoyable. So a company I've learned about recently called ASAP is perfecting how artificial intelligence helps customer service agents be 200 to 300% more productive and dramatically increase net promoter scores for their customers they engage with, because artificial intelligence improves how they do their job, right? So there's a lot of traditional theory behind this. It's changing in significant ways. So the old theories about how work gets done are changing dramatically. And then obviously on the bottom right, there's just fundamental seismic shifts going on in our society. So earlier we talked about millennials. They make up the majority of our workforce, perhaps in your organization as well. And Gen Z and millennials have different expectations about work. I remember reading a paper that talked about millennials changing their jobs, departments, and companies more than 17 times in their career. My dad worked for one company for 36 years. He was a chemical engineer. He started working for what's now Bayer, was Monsanto, never left the company. That is so unusual now. So the reality is, don't take it personally. Gen Z and millennial have very different expectations, and they expect it to show up in their learning and their development, their rate of promotion, the types of jobs and opportunities they have, the way your organization is connected from a purpose perspective, and what they expect to do, not just in your company, but in the communities where you live and work. So these things are happening. I know you're aware of them. They're just happening bigger and faster. So in the next few slides, we're going to talk about 9 key factors that I'd suggest you think about to help your organization renew and thrive. coming out of COVID. On this first slide, we're going to talk about who we are. So in this model, there are 9 factors. We're going to focus on the 3 in the center of this diagram. The ones in black are about who we are. So the first one we're going to talk about is purpose. The second one is your value agenda. And the third is going to be your culture, your secret sauce. Each of these 3 matter. I'll unpack them briefly for you now. The first one is around purpose. That is the why that glues your team together for a common goal. Top performing organizations know that purpose is a must-have to attract and differentiate the org's identity, who you are, the why of your work, and it embodies everything the organization stands for. So ask yourself, is your organization today crystal clear on their purpose from a historical, emotional, social, and practical point of view that sets everything the company does in motion? It's an interesting question. A lot of companies are not really clear about their why. They're much more clear about the what and the how of their work. So I was looking around some companies I admire. Perhaps you do as well. These are some company examples I'll share with you of organizations that are among the most admired, and it starts with their purpose. So I'm not advocating for any of these companies, but I'll share a few as examples. The first is Nike. Their purpose is to unite the world through sport to create a healthy planet, active communities, and an equal playing field for all. Our purpose moves us. I love that. Google, they're a little polarizing, but Google has a very clear purpose as well, to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. Or Apple, to bring the best personal computing products and support to students, educators, designers, scientists, engineers, business persons, and consumers around the world. 3 examples of purpose, the why they do things. I would also add that Apple has a relentless focus on exceptional user experience. That's emotional, visceral, physical, right? This is important. So ask yourself, is your company crystal clear on the why? Because when the why is clear, a lot of other things flow naturally. From there, now think about your value agenda. All companies have a strategy for how they create value, but few really know exactly how they achieve it. Top organizations solve this by creating a value agenda. It actually can be a map that breaks it apart between the company's ambitions or targets into tangible elements, such as business units, regions, product lines, even capabilities. And those that do it really well set themselves apart from a lot of other organizations. So once you have this map, companies can better articulate where their value is created and what really sets their company apart and what propels them into the future. Done right, why this matters is that you can connect the work and the value of the company all the way down to each employee and exactly what they do. So they see a direct connection between their role and exactly how they do it and the value of the organization, which has to link to purpose. These things have to be connected. Third, let's move on to culture. All right. And we all, I think, have a sense for what culture is. It's the way things get done in your org. It's not broad themes or posters or signature lines. They really don't cut it. I know you might be looking to yourself thinking, gosh, there's a poster right outside my office with our culture. That's okay. We've all done it. The reality is the main ingredient is observable behaviors all employees adhere to, ideally by choice, right? So leaders at every level have to own and role model and integrate the core aspects of your culture into their behavior, everything they do. If it's just a tagline or a poster or a signature line, employees know that. And if that culture is not real or authentic, if they don't see leaders walking the talk, they won't buy in and the culture won't have nearly the impact that it could. So I'll share an example here. Amazon is a company that is known for its culture, and it's not for everybody, and they don't try and be for everybody. What they do is they're authentic and clear about who they are. So a couple artifacts, practices in the Amazon culture that I think are fascinating. First of all, they invite the customer symbolically to every meeting by keeping an empty chair in the meeting room. Think about pre-COVID. 2 pizza rule. No more than 2 pizzas at a meeting. If you need more than that, your meeting's too big. I love the fact they don't do PowerPoints. Here we're doing PowerPoints, but imagine if you lived by Microsoft Word docs that were sent out in advance of the pre-read And then you spent the first few minutes of our meeting in silence reading the documents so you're prepared to jump right into discussion versus presenting. I love that. So that's just an example of something that's really, really strong around culture. Think about, how does your culture show up in your organization? Let's move on to the next slide. Here we're going to talk about the next set of factors. We talked about who we are. Now we're going to talk about how we operate. And we're going to talk about the three royal blue dynamics. The first of them is simplifying your org structure. The second is accelerating decision-making speed and accuracy. And third is really, how do you turbocharge your recruiting engine? So let's talk about radically flattening structure. As an HR geek, I'm fascinated by org design. We all know execs, and many of us HR geeks love org charts to describe our organization structure. Future-ready orgs really don't focus nearly as much on org charts with boxes and lines showing how people are connected, but on connectivity. Who works on what, with who, and how? It's about how work gets done most effectively, not to enable control, command and control, and micromanagement. So as I was looking for organizations to do some really interesting things here, I don't know if you're familiar with the Chinese company named Haier. They manufacture appliance and electronics, and they organize thousands of micro enterprise teams around three things. Either they're a transformation team focused on continuous improvement of current products, incubation teams, which break through new products, brand new concepts, or they're on a node, which is a centralized support team with products and services. They don't have traditional departments, management layers, yet work gets done really, really well because they're organized very, very differently. So imagine an organization that is boundaryless, that's not set up in a traditional way. I guess the ask of you is to think about your spans and layers and spend more time thinking about how work gets done, how individuals and teams connect with each other to get work done, as opposed to traditional hierarchies and layers. So it's a different way to think. Obviously, we don't have time to get into a lot, but it's a fascinating concept about radically transforming and flattening your organization for speed and decision-making. Next is around decision-making. Teams that make decisions fast and well are twice as likely to make high-quality calls and outperform their peers in the market. So think about your organization, how fast you think you really are. The key here is that decisions are made at the right level with a bias to push to the lowest level with great data, and enterprise-wide decisions are left to go to the most senior level leaders. So I used to work for a company that was incredibly tightly run by the chairman and founder. Everything that was large had to go through his office. And while it was nice to have his perspective and we always learned from him, we were incredibly slow and bureaucratic. Ask yourself, are decisions being made in a truly empowered, decentralized way where they should? You know best. So imagine Cisco, right? The massive food distributor, COVID hits, they had to pivot to support grocery and restaurant customers using their supply chain expertise overnight. The CEO talked about a month of decisions had to be made daily, every single day. The same happened at my company at Radial, where, as I said before, e-commerce volumes doubled overnight. And for many of our clients, we were their only channel for e-commerce supply chain, the only connection between them and their customers who couldn't or wouldn't go into their stores. So imagine the challenging of how you have to make decisions incredibly fast and doing it accurately. Trial by error is going to be key here. And then last is around talent. You have to treat talent as scarcer than capital. Top organizations are clear and focused on three talent imperatives. The first of all is to ask yourself, what talent do we really need to thrive? Ask yourself if you've asked that question of yourself and your leaders recently. What do you really need to thrive? The reality is that in many cases, only 25 to 50 roles really matter, often at low levels. It's not just senior level people. So this gets into the question of who adds the most value to our performance as a company and what our customers need. Second, how do we attract the best team in those roles? This is where culture, purpose, and employee engagement levels matter most. Great people have choices. They're not going to come to your organization if you're not an amazing place to be. And third, ask yourself, how do we best support and manage them? right? We all want to aspire to have stars or rock stars everywhere that take on challenging work and do amazing things, but we have to focus on how to do that really well. So here's an example that I love from Netflix. They actually have more than 200 unique aspects for how they build their organization, but one that's intriguing is they proudly manage out adequate talent. That's an interesting concept. We manage out adequate talent with early generous severance packages. They recognize that while they're careful who they bring in, sometimes it turns out to be a bad fit. You could go ahead and prolong those things for months or years, or make a respectful, proactive decision and upgrade the organization quickly. It's ultimately done respectfully, good for that employee, good for the team, and healthy for the business. Unique. Ask yourself, how flexible and agile are you about upgrading your team when you need to? So these are some thoughts about how you focus on these dimensions of how you operate. Now let's move on to the next slide. Now we're going to talk about how we grow. Three concepts here. One is, how do you develop an open ecosystem-minded strategy that opens up innovation and speed within and outside your organization? Second is data. How do you understand and harness data science platforms to drive faster decision-making and make it a core capability? And third is learning. How do you build a growth mindset with a full commitment to organizational learning as a core capability? So we'll talk about these three. This ecosystem view is an interesting one. The old thinking is that organizations gain leverage and control their supply chain with a death grip to create barriers to entry in their particular space, whatever it may be. And I've worked for companies that acted that way. The reality is that that was never really a sustainable strategy. And COVID has shown that it's even harder to do now. So here, the new thinking is that successful companies blur those boundaries and they view their partners as core to themselves and create a vested or win-win relationship between themselves and their core partners with shared targets. Think about lucrative incentives instead of service level agreement penalties, right? I've negotiated many contracts with partners over the time. The reality is there was almost a competitive dynamic between us, when the new mindset is to embrace your partners and open things up. So let me share a few examples. One of them is Amazon. And again, Amazon is a polarizing organization, but one thing they've done is they've grown from an online bookseller to, it depends on the day, the most valuable company in the world from a market cap perspective, because they do things very differently. Here, Amazon, if you've noticed, it seemed like overnight, I just started seeing hundreds of Amazon vans showing up around the greater Denver area where I live. The reality is they're all over the country and increasingly around the world. They did that because they fostered a last mile delivery startup strategy where they identified top employees in their own organization and they said, we want to help you become an instrumental part of our supply chain and delivery network. We're going to give you seed money, help you lease vans and training to become independent, homegrown Amazon delivery partners. What a fascinating idea to go ahead and extend their last mile capabilities by exponentially growing their workforce in a unique way, because they knew there were limitations in the traditional approach. And they set up a vested relationship with those employees by starting a business together with them. Now think about the type of engagement and loyalty those employees have to Amazon as they help them start their own business, doing something incredibly important at this time. Let's talk about Tesla. I wish I had a Tesla. I can't afford one yet, but Tesla made the decision back in 2014 to open up their source patents to encourage partnerships. So a really visible example of this is when Tesla said, we know that creating an electric vehicle that the world covets is not going to work if we don't have charging stations everywhere. So what did they do? They opened up their software and their strategy to charging station partners and said, help us build a network so that wherever our Tesla owners live and drive, you're there as well. They couldn't have done that without an open, collaborative partnership. I worked for a company years ago called i2. It's now called JDA. Back in the late 90s, they came up with an incredible idea that's now commonplace, and that is, how do you use the internet to connect on a real-time basis manufacturers, distributors, suppliers, companies, and customers all on the web. That was actually unbelievably revolutionary back in the mid 90s. I joined the company in 2000 when it was still a bit of an emergent idea. That's a perfect example of an open ecosystem connecting everybody on the web real time for great experience. That is cool. Now let's talk about the next one. Data science, building data-rich tech platforms. I'm not a techie, so bear with me, but I love the idea. Future-oriented companies know data is the business, so they invest in data governance, cloud-based technology, and redesign their processes and budgets to make sure that they can adjust dynamically or every day based on what they learn. So how many of you work for companies with annual capital and expense budgets that are similarly locked in stone for a year? Right? I have. That's been my experience through most of my career. The reality is that future-oriented companies think very differently about how data is obtained, analyzed, and used on a daily basis to fundamentally shift what and how they do things. So here's an example that all of you can probably appreciate, since most of you are probably Netflix customers. There's several 100 million of them around the world. Netflix became a streaming video powerhouse with massive numbers of subscribers because they used massive data sets and AI to build and refine their recommendation engine, right? Which drives more than 80% of their customer viewing time, right? So that's an example of how they're using data to make a huge difference in the product and service they offer. And I'm sure you have examples as well. All right. Now let's move on to this last one around accelerating learning. Great orgs have learned that building an empowered, agile business is based on building a team that's comfortable with failing. I don't just mean failing, but failing fast, learning and repeating, or fail fast forward. Another way to think about it. I think of it in just general as building an organization full of learners, not knowers. There's a big difference there. Think about the people you work with. Who's a knower versus a learner? Learners are infectious. They're curious. They're humble. They're energizing. They're the people you want to work with. They're respectful because they have questions for you. They want to better understand everything they can. Core to this is this beginner's mindsets, right? This curiosity, humility, this comfort with failure. So let me give you an example. Most of you have heard of Microsoft, right? Microsoft has been a world-class company for decades, but they got stale for about a decade. If you notice, their share price was hanging around the mid 30s for a long, long time. If you check recently, they're over 100. Their new CEO, Satya Nadella, maybe not so new anymore, credits the idea of a growth mindset as one of the critical great unlocks for his organization. What he says is a huge part of the reinvention was that he often says, I have a hypothesis. Let's go test it to see if it's valid. If it's wrong, let's try something different. It's one of his favorite phrases. I love it because it sends the message of, I've got a hypothesis. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but let's test it. Let's learn fast forward together. Another example is Google, right? Their 20% time. I've talked to a lot of Googlers that say it's awful hard to get the actual 20%, but the idea is aspirational, but it's a statement about how important personal development and growth is. And some of their best ideas come from that time they give employees to learn. So to close this one out, centralized bureaucratic programs, they have to be updated. I built many of them, award-winning ones, frankly. I'm proud of them, but the reality is they have to change, or even replaced with individual learning journeys with core and personalized training at scale, real time, faster than ever. So employees are rewarded for what new competencies they learn and demonstrate in the job, instead of just this compliance-based check the box mentality we have for so much training today. The good news is that so many employees are so excited to learn and grow, especially our millennials, right, Gen Zers. That's what they expect. Building platforms and capabilities and tools for real-time customized learning is the name of the game now. Organizations creating that. All right, so let's move on. So this is a summary of some of what I just covered. 30 top companies were asked what were the areas they were going to make big moves around these 9 imperatives. And you can see the top 5 in terms of investments with big, big bets of time and money are purpose, ecosystems, tech platforms, talent, and learning. So as HR leaders that are on this webinar, you can see your direct connection to at least 3 of them, and you can help unlock capabilities in ecosystem and tech platforms. So the good news is that leading organizations are doing this. If yours not quite there, it can be. So I'm going to turn it to Andrew, who's got our first poll question. So we'll throw it out to you. What actions do you think CEOs think are most important to closing these capability gaps? Contracting, retaining employees, external hiring, or building skills internally? I'll give it a minute, let you poll in.
This is fascinating, Eric, as we wait for our poll questions our poll responses to come through.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you spoke about capability building, and just how CEOs think about that. I'd love to get some of your early thoughts on pre and post pandemic. We touched on that a little bit earlier. Can you expand on that a little bit? Tell us why that's so important. The shift there and possible shifts that we might not know.
Around building capabilities, Andrew?
Right.
Yeah. I guess it's just my opinion, and many of you may share or have different view. Our organizations all provide a product or service. The reality is that in many places they're quite commoditized, and people have choices about where they take their precious time and dollars for things that matter. So those capabilities really are the sustainable competitive advantage that your organization hopefully can build. And that's kind of the challenge we should be asking ourselves as organizational leaders is, how do we build that competitive advantage in a unique way?
And so do you think these results is this a surprise to you?
Doesn't surprise me. Hopefully it doesn't surprise everybody internally. It actually matches what our CEOs in this poll said themselves. It actually matches pretty closely in terms of their view. So I congratulate the team for having a good view of what CEOs are thinking about as well in their mind. Building those internal capabilities is where I'd suggest, and leading CEOs would concur, is where you invest your time and money. It's frankly, quote, easy to outsource or contract, but it can be expensive. It can often be ineffective. In the end, what we talked about so far is your employees want to learn and grow. They'll stay and they'll give you their full engagement levels if you understand what's on their mind, asking them what they expect, what they want to learn, what type of culture and climate and purpose they want to be a part of is critically important. And good engagement surveys from Tiny Polls, for example, can be incredibly impactful in getting real-time data. Instead of guessing or getting isolated views, get the real-time data from teams and know what's on their mind and then act on it. So good. I appreciate the team getting that one. We have another poll question that Andrew's got teed up. What percentage of senior leaders believe capability building programs deliver the expected ROI? From never to always.
This ought to be a fascinating one, and I think this really highlights the difference between what actually is and what leaders expect from their investments and being able to realize that ROI. What are some of your thoughts on that delta there? I mean, I can just think of so many examples from my past, but would love to hear from your experience.
Well, I'm curious what the team thinks, but my experience has been that a lot of the best laid plans really just don't deliver on what was expected. And the delta can be hugely impactful for the organization and their performance. So we'll see what the poll says.
We're just about to critical mass here before we jump into Q&A. Here's our...
Yeah, on the last poll, it turns out that 53% of CEOs felt like building internal capabilities was the most important. Roughly 20% in external hiring, redeploying employees, 8% around contracting. On this next one, what percent of senior leaders believe capability building programs deliver the ROI? Looks like the leader in the clubhouse at 47% is sometimes. Based on the survey, the reality is that only 33% of the time did CEOs believe they delivered their ROI. So some pretty low numbers, which begs the question, and I wonder if this is a common practice in your organization. Call it an after-action review. Sometimes the best learning comes from examining your failures when something doesn't work. Does the team take the time and go back into a systematic, thoughtful review and non-judgmental, curious, growth mindset-oriented manner to figure out what didn't go right? What can we learn? What went well? What do we protect? But then how do we do this differently? And if you can create a safe environment for employees that were involved to really open up and say, yeah, this didn't go well, and I didn't deliver on my part, and here's why. That is gold if you can create that environment where employees can really open up, you can learn. So big challenges. If you as an organization, an HR leader, can deliver on the ROI expected, you have a bright future ahead, but it comes with really careful planning, execution, and then making sure you go back and review what didn't work and why in an open way.
Terrific, terrific. I understand Eric, you shared with me the dirty dozen of employee engagement. I'm dying to see this one.
Yeah, well, those were some of the areas. We've covered the 9. Let's talk about employee engagement, right? So I love working in this space, and I know that employee engagement, if done well, can have a massive sustainable impact on how organizations perform. Your shareholders, your employees, your customers will feel it. And you know, as a consumer yourself, when you deal with an employee that feels engaged, even if it's strictly by phone, which is what we're doing a lot these days. Here are some stats from a leading employee engagement research company. I won't go through it in a lot of detail, but you can compare top quartile with bottom quartile engagement levels and the differences. I'll pick out a few. 23% more profitable if you have employees that tend to be in the top quartile of engagement versus bottom. Almost 20% more productive from a sales perspective. Let's look at turnover. 43% less turnover for low turnover, right? Defined as 40% or lower generally. How about safety? When an employee is injured, was involved in an accident, think about how disruptive that is for your organization, perhaps. 64% drop, that's pretty impressive. At the bottom, those at the 99th percentile in these dimensions have nearly 5 times the success rate of those at the opposite end. So employee engagement is not just a nice to do. All of us have a vested interest in it, but let's face it, it's hard to do well, hard to build. It's cumbersome to develop the right questions and to suit all audiences. The system hierarchy mapping, you've got timelines that can take 4 to 6 months to go from start to finish. How long do you think your executives are willing to wait for those type of insights? Peer-to-peer recognition is vital. It's hard to do, and HR teams are expected to build these recognition programs when you want to create something organic. How do you do that? Getting best practices and insights from your peers inside or outside the organization, not easy. From my experience, it's also expensive, right? Dollars are precious. How do you build the business case to invest in employee engagement? The reality is that there are great ways to do it. It's been a real honor to get to know the team at Tiny Pulse, who have some incredibly breakthrough ideas for how to do it. And obviously, this is one of the wonderful critical enablers for how you unlock performance in your organization. And here's your business case. You can find the stats that suit your organization yourself, but the numbers are compelling. The question is, what are you doing to unlock the highest level of engagement in your organization? One employee, one team, one department at a time. So at this point, I think we've got about 10 minutes left or so. That that's kind of the quick run through of a whole bunch of ideas. I appreciate your patience and your willingness to stick with me. There's a lot of information in there, but hopefully it got your brain churning about opportunities in your organization. With that,
Absolutely, absolutely, Eric, and thank you so much for being here. Riveting stuff indeed. From my perspective, we'll jump right into Q&A. I've been taking a look at the highest voted questions today, and this one comes up actually a lot for the people that we bring on the show, the thought leaders and folks who have seen and done it all. So I'm going to wrap a couple of questions together. One comes from an anonymous attendee, Patrick Robson. Shout out, Patrick. I see you. This really is about the balance of carrying out a vision, carrying out a mission, carrying out a company's goals, while and maintaining a culture that both is a mix of autocratic and democratic. And no, I'm just going to go there, Patrick, Eric. It's the idea of what percent would you say, decision making, sharing feedback, taking employee feedback. How much is, hey, we're leadership, we've got to make decisions versus, hey, I've got to talk to the team and get their feedback. If you had to put a number on it, I know there is no number, but if you had to put a number on it, what is the balance between we've got to make decisions versus I've got to get the team on board?
Mhm. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I don't know if there's a bright line answer for this one because every organization differs in terms of who they are and how they want to operate. In general, I would think our job is to push our leaders to drive decision making down as low as possible and just get out of the way. So I mentioned earlier, we were talking about org design. The job of your most senior leadership team is to only focus, in my opinion, on the things that are enterprise wide, things that have a massive long-term impact, things that require significant investment, and set purpose and broad strategy. But the day-to-day decision making should go low as possible, and don't micromanage. As to when you ask employees for their input, I would say why not versus why. In general, there are quick, efficient ways to get a quick pulse on employee points of view with a single question or two that can be really enlightening. Many frontline supervisors and managers, in my experience, don't have the time, the confidence, or the skill to know how to dig in and ask the right question and know what to do with the data. So again, great tools are out there to tap in. And in general, I would say, ask yourself, why am I not checking in more as opposed to why am I?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the insights can be enlightening.
Absolutely. So this next question comes from an anonymous attendee. You mentioned that only 25 to 30 roles really matter at an org, and oftentimes it's not always upper management. And so this listener's curious to learn more. For example, at your company, what are some of the lower level roles that are part of the critical 25 that matter, to your previous comment?
Yeah, so I spent a number of years at Dish Network, and it's a founder-led company with a visionary chairman and CEO. The reality is that he would be among the first people to say that I don't matter. I have made billion-dollar mistakes over the years, and the people that matter most are, and we'd single out two, and by no means are we trying to indict other employees, terrific people doing incredibly important work that make the whole machine run well, but two employees at Dish, the voice and the face of the company. The voice were our customer experience agents, right? Dish Network would take over 100 million calls a year or chats from customers asking about their bill or their technology or changing programming. An agent that is empathetic, informed, efficient, and can take care of customers the first time, the right way, will make or break you. On the other hand, how many businesses have their employees in your customers' homes every day? More than 25,000 customer home visits a day at Dish Network. You want to make sure that that technician is professional, polite, trained, has a clean background check. They're going to be in your home, in your master bedroom, setting up a TV. You want to trust that they're not going to be doing things in your home that are inappropriate. And those two employee roles were incredibly important for Dish Network success, because in the end, you want to be able to put a remote in that customer's hands, teach them how to find the shows they love, and to bring their family together to enjoy what you offer. And those two roles would make or break us. It wasn't the head of HR or the CIO, right? We're there to enable those frontline employees to do great work. And that was our view about a right side up organization, where the frontline employees at the top of the inverted triangle and the CEO and chairman at the bottom of the triangle. And all of us would look upward to figure out what's my line of sight to those employees. Call it the right side up organization.
Terrific. And so in line with right side up organizations, how did you develop that line of sight? I mean, there's people and process and technology. What are some of the ways that viewers today could, get working on that?
Um, well, the wake up call for Dish was the fact that the video services industry is in the bottom quartile of all companies in the JD Powers and ACSI surveys, which is a real slap in the face to our leaders who are working incredibly hard. So about a decade ago, I was there when we challenged ourselves and said, we're going to be number one in our industry, and then we're going to transcend our industry, and we're going to move in the third and second and first quartile for a provider of product or service. We were the process. The reality is that there's no one answer for how you do this. We started with doing customer journeys, and we started from that perspective of what does the customer experience with us from every step of the way, from the time they're thinking about us as a potential service provider to a long-time customer. Mapping out customer journeys is a tremendous amount of work, and there are companies that can help you with that. But it's extremely enlightening when you look at every single contact point. In Dish's case, we found that we were actually annoying the hell out of our customers with emails and phone calls and paper mail, to the point where we took a happy customer and we frustrated the heck out of them. And then to make matters worse, we kept on changing their pricing every 90 days, to the point where they started to distrust us. So long story short, the process is unraveling every single customer touch point and figuring out, as you said, Andrew, from a people, process, and technology standpoint, how can we break this down into the interactions that matter most for customer experience and figure out what do they want versus what do we do, and then figuring out how we close that gap. It takes many, many months, but it is work that's so enlightening, and it can transform everything about how your company functions.
Terrific. And I know folks were just coming up on time, but we did get a little bit of a later start. I love this question. Eric, last question for you is developing and retaining talent. This comes from an anonymous attendee. What are your best practices? What's your number one piece of advice for retaining the best talent outside of compensation, let's say?
Yeah, it's hard to win on total rewards, although that's usually where people start, around compensation and benefits. I'm not suggesting that's not important, but my simple rule for how you retain your people is ask them what makes you happy, right? What keeps you engaged about your work? And they'll tell you. Oftentimes, employees have never been asked. And I found many times when you say, give me your top 5 motivators, many employees will pause and think, I don't know if I can answer that. I need a minute. Give it to your people as homework. As a leader, I ask every direct report in our next one-on-one, which I do weekly, by the way, I'd ask them, come back to me with your top 5 motivators, what that is. For some people, that's projects. Some it's time off. Sometimes it's promotion. Sometimes it's pay, Andrew. Sometimes it can be visibility. Others have told me, I just want to thank you notes. I don't ever want to be publicly recognized. It's embarrassing, right? I feel selfish. It could be rotational assignments, right? It just depends. Don't assume you know. So just ask. I think if you actually ask and deeply listen with a combination of personal care, really deeply caring, and then use that to directly challenge your people going forward, you might find that the candor and the trust you build can be amazing around engagement levels. So I just simply asked and done my best to listen.
Amazing stuff, Eric. And for those of us, we're going to sign off in just a minute here. Please do enter your survey responses for us. Eric, would you like to? Where do you want to direct our viewers today? What parting message do you have for us?
Wow, that's a good one. I would say, if I had to pick an idea, I would say, first, remember the headline here. the backdrop of what's happening in our world is unprecedented, right? There's social, political, and frankly, physical, medical upheaval going on around the world that hopefully we'll never see again. It's easy to curl up in a ball and figure, I'm just going to try and ride this out. On the other hand, we are capable of doing such exceptional things when we recognize opportunities and take advantage of them together. So I would be a student of this time in your organization. Ask powerful questions about how do we thrive during and coming out of this pandemic, and be open to the conversation. Many of the ideas we share in this webinar may not make sense, but maybe there's a nugget or two that stimulates your thinking. You can go back to your peers and your leaders and say, I've been thinking about X. How can we get better at this to thrive? And I think it's just all about starting the dialogue. Don't be afraid to get in there and start the conversation. You don't have to be a business expert. Just be curious and create that beginner's mindset. And who knows where the world will take you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Eric Wohl, for coming on our show today. Please follow him on LinkedIn. Hit him up if you do want to work with him. He does just some fantastic content today. So if you want to learn more, please contact him. I'm happy to put you in touch. For those of us here at Tiny Pulse, we'll see you next time. Next week, VP of Product from Microsoft, Omar Shaheen's joining us on the show. Thanks for watching.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everybody.